My daughter's math teacher called me into her classroom in Omaha, Nebraska, after school, sat me down across from her desk, and told me, with a kind of practiced, regretful certainty, that Zora simply wasn't college material, and that we should consider moving her out of the advanced math track before the transition became too disruptive to her confidence. My name is Mina Castor, though everyone calls me Mina, and my daughter Zora was 12 years old, finishing 7th grade with a 94% average in her advanced math class, a course she'd fought hard to be placed into the previous year after an initial placement test that had, admittedly, been close, but that she'd worked considerably harder than most students to catch up on. Spending countless evenings with extra practice problems until she was consistently outperforming several classmates who'd been placed into the track more easily than she had. "I don't understand," I told Mrs. Winthrop, genuinely confused by a recommendation that didn't match anything I understood about Zora's actual performance. "Her grades have been excellent all year." "What exactly is prompting this conversation? There are only so many spots in next year's accelerated track," Mrs. Winthrop said, her tone carrying the specific, careful diplomacy of someone delivering news she'd clearly rehearsed. "The administration has to make difficult decisions about which students are truly suited for that level of rigor going forward. I think Zora would honestly be happier and more successful in the standard track." I want to be honest about how disoriented that conversation left me, driving home with a growing, uncomfortable sense that something about the explanation didn't actually add up. Zora's grades were excellent. Her standardized test scores, which I'd reviewed carefully every semester, consistently placed her in the top tier of her grade. I couldn't reconcile, not college material, with any actual data I had access to about my own daughter's academic performance. I requested a formal meeting with the school's principal, Desmond Achterberg, the following week, bringing with me a complete record of Zora's grades, test scores, and teacher evaluations from the previous 2 years, hoping for a clearer explanation than the vague, diplomatic language Mrs. Winthrop had offered. What I got instead, after considerable persistence, was a piece of information I hadn't anticipated needing to uncover at all. Principal Achterberg, growing visibly uncomfortable as I pressed for specific, data-based justification for Zora's removal from the accelerated track, eventually admitted that the advanced math program's incoming class size for the following year had been reduced from 30 students to 24. A reduction driven by budget considerations tied to construction of the school's new STEM wing, a major capital project funded substantially through a donation from a local business family. The Kettleworths, whose son Sterling was currently enrolled in the same advanced math class as Zora. "I'm not saying there's any direct connection," Principal Achterberg said, in a tone that made clear he understood exactly how the situation actually looked. "But I'd be lying if I said donor relationships never factor into these kinds of enrollment and placement decisions in ways that aren't always formally documented." I want to be honest about the specific, cold clarity that settled over me hearing that admission, understanding that my daughter's academic placement, something I'd naively assumed was determined entirely by objective performance data, might actually be influenced by something considerably less transparent. I filed a formal records request with the district the following week, requesting Zora's complete academic file alongside anonymized data on the full incoming accelerated math track roster, comparing grade point averages and standardized test scores across all 24 students selected for the reduced program. What that comparison revealed, once the district's records office finally provided the full dataset 5 weeks later, reframed the entire situation considerably. Zora's combined academic performance metrics placed her solidly in the top third of all students being considered for the accelerated track. Sterling Kettleworth's performance metrics, by direct comparison, placed him in the bottom quarter of the same applicant pool, with a current course average nearly 11 percentage points lower than Zora's. I brought this data to a formal meeting with the school board's academic policy committee, a meeting I requested specifically after consulting with an education advocacy attorney, Priyanka Okonkwo-Bellamy, who specialized in exactly the kind of transparency and equal access concerns this situation seemed to represent. Not here to accuse anyone of anything I can't support with data. I told the committee, laying out the full comparative performance records alongside Principal Lichterberg's own acknowledgement about donor considerations factoring into enrollment decisions. I'm here because my daughter, who has consistently outperformed a significant portion of the students selected for this program, was told she wasn't college material, rather than given any actual, transparent explanation for her removal. Committee's subsequent investigation, conducted over the following 6 weeks, uncovered internal email correspondence between the district superintendent's office and the school's development department, discussing, in language considerably more direct than anything Principal Lichterberg had verbally acknowledged, an explicit request from the Kettleworth family that Sterling be guaranteed placement in the accelerated math track as part of the broader partnership agreement surrounding the STEM wing donation. I want to be honest about how uncomfortable and how validating it felt seeing that email correspondence laid out in the committee's formal findings, confirming what Principal Lichterberg had only obliquely acknowledged during our original conversation. The school board, presented with this documentation, voted to formally revise the district's academic placement policy, explicitly prohibiting any consideration of donor relationships or financial contributions in determining student enrollment in accelerated academic programs, and specifically ordered a reevaluation of the following year's accelerated math track roster, based purely on documented academic performance metrics. Zora was reinstated to the accelerated track 2 weeks later, alongside 2 other students who had similarly been quietly displaced by the same donor-influenced decision, a correction that, I want to be honest, generated its own uncomfortable ripple through the school community once the situation became more widely known among other parents. I want to describe what happened with Sterling Kettleworth, because I think it matters to understanding how this story actually resolved with more nuance than a simple villain narrative might suggest. Sterling remained in the standard math track, where, according to his own teacher's subsequent reports, he actually performed considerably better once removed from a level of academic pressure that had clearly exceeded his genuine readiness. A detail that made me feel, honestly, a complicated sympathy for a 12-year-old who had never asked to be placed in an accelerated program his own family's donation had apparently guaranteed him, regardless of whether it actually served his genuine academic interests. I ran into Sterling's mother, Genevieve Kettleworth, at a school event several months later, an interaction I approached with considerably more caution than triumph, understanding that whatever unfair advantage her family's donation had originally secured, she was still another parent navigating her own child's education with the same fundamental hope every parent brings to that process. "Owe you an apology," she said, somewhat unexpectedly. I didn't fully understand, when we made that request, how directly it would affect another specific student. I think I was so focused on giving Sterling every possible advantage that I didn't consider what that advantage might actually be costing someone else. I want to be honest that I didn't need that apology quite as much as she seemed to believe I did. Understanding that the district's policy change and Zora's reinstatement based on her actual, documented merit mattered considerably more to me than any individual acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But I appreciated the honesty nonetheless, understanding how rarely privilege gets examined this directly, this openly, once its actual mechanics are laid bare through formal documentation rather than left comfortably unspoken. I want to tell you what happened with Zora over the following year, because I think it matters considerably more than the policy victory itself. She finished 8th grade with the highest average in her accelerated math cohort, and the following spring, based on a recommendation from her math teacher, not Mrs. Winthrop, who had since transferred to a different school, but a new teacher who reviewed Zora's actual performance data with considerably more care, was accepted into a highly competitive summer mathematics enrichment program at a regional university, one of only 14 students selected statewide. I think often about that original conversation in Mrs. Winthrop's classroom, about the phrase, "not college material," delivered with such practiced, diplomatic certainty about a 12-year-old who was, by every actual measurable standard, considerably more academically capable than the explanation offered for her removal ever suggested. Zora doesn't know the full details of the donor influence that nearly derailed her academic placement, though she's aware, in general terms, that some unfair things happened with the math program that got fixed. I've made a deliberate choice not to burden her with the specifics, understanding that her actual academic trajectory, protected now by a formally revised policy that will hopefully prevent this exact situation from happening to some other student's child in the future, matters considerably more than any detailed accounting of the political maneuvering required to secure it.